It was a quiet afternoon in a small neighborhood, the kind of day where everything felt slow and peaceful. Birds were chirping in the distance, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the street. An elderly woman named Margaret was sitting on her wooden porch, enjoying the gentle breeze. She loved this time of diet, was when she could sip her tea, listen to the sounds of nature, and feel a sense of calm. For her, these moments were precious because they gave her peace and reminded her of the simple joys in life. But that peaceful afternoon was about to change in a way she could never have imagined. As Margaret adjusted the blanket around her lap, she suddenly noticed movement at the far end of the street. At first, she thought it was just a child playing, but as the figure came closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. It was a dear little girl, no more than 7 years old, running with all her strength. Her tiny feet pounded against the pavement, her hair messy and her eyes wide with fear. She looked around desperately, as though she was being chased. Though no one was visible behind her, Margaret leaned forward, concern immediately washing over her face. She could see the child's cheeks glistening with tears, and even from a distance. The girl's panic was unmistakable. Her arms moved wildly as she ran, and her lips trembled like she wanted to scream but couldn't find the words. Margaret's heart began to race. She was elderly and not as strong as she used to be, but the sight of a child in distress pushed her worries aside. She stood up slowly, clutching the railing for balance, her eyes never leaving the frightened girl. As the girl got closer, Margaret could hear small sobs mixed with gasps for breath. It was clear she had been running for some time. When she finally reached the porch, she didn't stop to explain or catch her breath. Instead, she threw herself against Margaret, clutching her arm tightly as if she had finally found a safe place. Margaret could feel the girl's tiny hands trembling, her body shaking uncontrollably. The child buried her face against Margaret's sleeve, and the old woman instinctively wrapped her arms around her, trying to comfort her the way a grandmother would comfort her grandchild. "My dear, what's wrong?" Margaret asked softly, her voice calm but filled with worry. But the girl didn't answer right away. She kept shaking, gasping for air, and looking over her shoulder as though she feared someone or something might appear at any moment. Margaret gently rubbed her back, whispering, "It's all right. You're safe now. Nobody will hurt you." Here, finally, the girl lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the courage. Her wide, fearful eyes locked onto Margaret's, pleading silently for help. The old woman could see that this wasn't just a child upset over a scraped knee or a lost toy. This was fear of something much bigger, something that had shaken her to her core. Margaret crouched down so that her eyes were level with the girl's. "You can tell me, sweetheart," she said gently. "Whatever it is, I'll listen. You're safe with me." The girl's voice finally broke through the sobs. But it was barely a whisper, almost as if she was afraid someone else might hear. "I need help," she said, her words trembling. Margaret leaned closer, straining to catch every word. The girl's breath came in short, sharp gasps, but her tone was urgent, too urgent to ignore. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She didn't yet know what the child was about to reveal, but she already understood it was serious. Her instincts told her this was not a small matter. The way the girl's eyes darted around, the way her body shook it, all screamed of danger. Margaret's years had taught her to recognize true fear when she saw it, and this was as real as it could get. In that moment, the world around them seemed to fall silent. The birds no longer mattered. The gentle wind no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was this little girl clinging to her, desperate for safety, desperate for someone to trust. Margaret tightened her embrace, silently promising that, whatever the child had to say, she would believe her, and she would act. The elderly woman took a slow, steady breath, preparing herself for the words she knew would change everything. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just an encounter with a frightened child. This was the beginning of something far more serious. Margaret had no idea what the girl would whisper, but she knew deep down that life on this quiet street was about to change forever. The little girl clung to Margaret's arm as though it was the only safe thing left in the world. Her chest rose and fell quickly, every breath sharp and uneven. Margaret could feel the girl's small heart pounding against her as if it wanted to escape. For a moment, they both stayed frozen, an old woman trying to calm a terrified child, and a child trying to find the strength to speak. Margaret stroked the girl's hair gently, her voice calm and steady. "It's all right, darling. Take your time. You're safe here with me. Nobody can hurt you now." The old woman had raised children and grandchildren of her own, and she knew that sometimes silence carried heavier truths than words. She waited, patiently giving the girl the space to gather herself. Finally, the girl's trembling lips parted. Her voice was so faint, so broken, that Margaret had to lean in close to catch the words. "There's someone in trouble," the girl whispered. Her eyes darted nervously toward the street, as if she expected shadows to leap out and prove her right. Margaret frowned, her heart tightening with unease. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Who's in trouble?" The girl swallowed hard, as though the words themselves were too heavy for her tiny frame. She whispered again, her words trembling, but this time more certain. "A lady. She needs help. Please. I saw it. She's not safe." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Children did not invent this kind of fear. A scraped knee could bring tears, but this look in the girl's eyes, this trembling voice, was born from witnessing something real, something dangerous. Margaret's instinct was to believe her, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. The old woman glanced toward the street, her mind racing. She had not heard anything unusual, no shouting, no cries, but the girl's urgency told a different story. "Where is she, child?" Margaret asked gently, keeping her tone calm even though her own heartbeat had quickened. The little girl wiped her tear-stained face with her sleeve. "Down there," she said, pointing with a shaky finger toward the row of houses at the end of the street. "I saw her. She was calling for help, but nobody heard her. Nobody stopped." Margaret's chest tightened. The thought of someone nearby in danger while the world carried on as usual sent a sharp pang through her. She looked into the girl's eyes again, searching for any sign of exaggeration or misunderstanding. But all she saw was raw fear and desperate honesty. Margaret knelt beside her, holding her shoulders gently. "You did the right thing coming here. You're very brave, my dear. But listen to me carefully now. We must help her, and we must do it the right way." The girl nodded quickly, though her tears still fell. She clutched Margaret's hand tighter, as if afraid the old woman might slip away. Margaret could feel the tiny fingers digging into her palm, and she realized how much trust the child had placed in her. The world seemed strangely still around them. A car passed by slowly in the distance, its driver oblivious to the urgency, hidden in the small corner of the street. The wind rustled the leaves, but it sounded different now, like whispers, urging Margaret to act. She knew that every second mattered. The girl leaned closer, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the air. "I think he's hurting her. I think she's in danger." Those words struck Margaret like a lightning bolt. A frightened child claiming to have seen someone in danger was not something she could ignore. The image of a helpless woman needing aid and a little girl powerless to stop it burned in her mind. She felt her age more heavily in that instant, her legs weak, her hands trembling, but her spirit refused to let her back away. Margaret squeezed the girl's hand firmly. "You're safe here, and I promise you I'll do everything I can. We'll get her help." The girl's eyes widened, relief mixing with her fear. It was as if she had carried a burden too heavy for her young shoulders, and now, finally, someone had agreed to share it. She took a deep, shaky breath, leaning against Margaret as though the old woman's strength could become her own. Margaret knew there was no time to lose. She could not run down the street herself, not at her age. She could not confront whatever danger the girl had seen. But she did have one thing, the presence of mind to call for real help. Asterisk as she reached into the pocket of her cardigan for her phone. Margaret thought about how fate had brought this girl to her porch. Out of all the houses, out of all the people, she had chosen Margaret. That choice, that trust, carried a weight Margaret would not ignore. The little girl whispered again, almost pleading this time, "Please, don't let her get hurt." Margaret pressed the child's hand reassuringly, her eyes steady and determined. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart. Not if I can help it." She knew exactly what needed to be done next. Margaret froze for a moment after hearing the girl's trembling confession. The words replayed in her mind, heavy like stones pressing on her chest. "I think he's hurting her." They weren't just words. They carried the weight of fear, urgency, and truth. She looked into the little girl's wide, tear-filled eyes and realized this was no childish exaggeration. The child had seen something no one her age should ever have to witness. Margaret had lived through many things in her long life. She had known joy and loss, calm days, and frightening nights, but there was something different about this moment. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about her peaceful porch or her afternoon tea. It was about a desperate child clinging to her, and a stranger whose safety hung in the balance. The responsibility felt almost too big for her frail shoulders. Yet she knew she had to carry it. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed the girl's messy hair away from her damp cheeks. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "are you certain about what you saw?" The girl nodded quickly, her lips pressed tightly together as though afraid she might burst into tears again if she spoke. Her silence said more than words could. Was the silence of someone who had witnessed something too real, too frightening. Margaret's heart raced. She knew time was precious, but she also understood how important it was to make the girl feel safe and heard. She pulled her closer and whispered, "You were very brave to tell me. I believe you. I promise. We'll do something." The girl's small frame seemed to relax slightly, but the fear in her eyes remained. She leaned into Margaret's arms, clutching her cardigan like a lifeline. Margaret could feel the girl's thin fingers digging into the fabric. That touch, that desperate grip, reminded her of how fragile and precious life was, and how easily it could slip away if no one stepped in. For a fleeting moment, Margaret felt her age weighing on her like never before. Her knees ached, her back was stiff, and her voice sometimes quivered with age. She wondered if she was strong enough to handle what lay ahead. But then she looked down at the little girl again. The child had run to her because she believed Margaret could help. To betray that trust was unthinkable. Margaret inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She reached for her phone with trembling hands. The screen glowed to life, and the familiar numbers of 911 loomed before her. But before she pressed them, she glanced at the girl again. "Tell me everything you can, darling," she said gently. "What did you see? What made you so afraid?" The girl's voice cracked as she answered, but her words were sharp and clear. "I saw a man. He was yelling. He grabbed her. She was trying to scream, but he covered her mouth. Nobody else was around. Nobody stopped to help." Margaret felt her stomach twist into a knot. She imagined the scene the girl described and shivered. The idea of someone suffering silently, hidden in plain sight, was unbearable. She tightened her grip on the phone. The little girl's whisper was not just a story, it was a plea for someone to act, and Margaret knew that someone was her. For a moment, she felt the world narrow into two choices. Ignore the whisper, dismiss it as a child's overactive imagination, and risk a tragedy unfolding. Or believe the whisper, act on it, and possibly save a life. There was no real choice at all. Margaret dialed the numbers with purpose, her finger firm on each button. As the phone rang in her ear, she thought about how strange it was that an ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary. She was no hero, just an old woman on her porch. Yet, somehow, she had been placed at the center of something that mattered deeply. The dispatcher's voice broke through her thoughts. 911. What's your emergency? Margaret spoke clearly, her tone calm but urgent. There's a child here who has seen a woman in danger. She says a man is hurting her, and I believe her. Please, you must send help quickly. The little girl clutched her hand tighter, her tear-streaked face watching Margaret with desperate hope. And in that moment, Margaret realized that the whisper she had just heard wasn't only a warning. It was a test of courage, of compassion, of whether or not someone would listen to a child when it mattered most. The whisper had become a weight, yes, but not one Margaret carried alone. The child had shared it with her, trusting her to do what she could not do herself. And now, Margaret had passed that weight forward to the people who could truly act, the emergency. Responders racing to the scene. The girl pressed her face into Margaret's arm again, her small body trembling less now, as though she had found comfort in being believed. Margaret stroked her hair gently, whispering, "You've done something very important, sweetheart. You've helped save someone today." Though the air around them still carried tension, Margaret felt a flicker of relief. The whisper that had seemed so fragile, so fleeting, had turned into a call for action that could change everything. The world outside went on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Neighbors stayed indoors. The evening sun dipped lower. But Margaret and the little girl knew better. They knew that behind the ordinary, something extraordinary had begun, and it all started with a whisper heavy enough to move mountains. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the phone, her thin fingers gripping it tighter than she thought possible. The voice of the 911 operator was calm and professional. But Margaret's mind was racing faster than her lips could form the words. She had always thought emergencies belonged to television shows or news headlines, never to her own quiet street. Yet here she was, making choices that could change everything. The little girl sat close beside her, her small body pressed against Margaret's side as though she was afraid of being left alone, even for a moment. Every now and then, the child glanced nervously toward the street, her eyes searching the shadows as though expecting the man she had described to appear at any second. Margaret squeezed her hand gently while she spoke into the phone. Yes, a child came to me, terrified. She says she saw a woman being attacked nearby. Please, you must send help quickly. We don't know if she's still in danger. The dispatcher asked for the address, and Margaret gave it clearly. Despite her shaking voice, she forced herself to stay composed. There was no time for fear now. The operator promised help was on the way and told her to keep the child safe until officers arrived. The call ended. But Margaret's heart did not slow. She placed the phone carefully on the small table beside her chair, her mind buzzing with what she had just done. She had made the decision, the only decision that mattered. She had acted, yet the weight of that choice still pressed down on her shoulders. What if the girl had been mistaken? What if no danger existed? Would the police think she had wasted their time? And then another thought pushed all doubt aside. What if the girl was right, and I had done nothing? Margaret knew she could not live with that. She looked at the child again and saw the truth written all over her trembling face. There was no mistake here. Something terrible was happening, and the girl had witnessed it. The old woman reached out, brushing the girl's cheek with her wrinkled fingers. Help is coming. she said softly. You don't have to be afraid anymore. The girl nodded, though her tears had not completely stopped. Her lips quivered as she whispered, Do you think they'll be in time? Oh, Margaret's heart squeezed at the question. She wanted to promise the child that everything would be fine, that the woman in danger would be rescued instantly, but she knew she could not lie. Instead, she chose the only truth she had. They will do everything they can, she answered, gently, and you've given them a chance to help her. That was very brave. The girl leaned her head against Margaret's arm, closing her eyes for a brief moment. It was as if the act of being believed, of having someone take her words seriously, gave her strength she hadn't known she had. Margaret sat silently, listening to the sounds around her. The street looked so ordinary, the hum of a car engine. In the distance, the laughter of children playing blocks away, the faint smell of someone grilling their dinner. It was almost impossible to believe that somewhere nearby, in the midst of all this normal life, someone could be suffering so terribly. That contrast made her decision feel even heavier. She realized that so many people might have ignored the whisper, might have dismissed the frightened child as confused or dramatic. But she had chosen differently. She had chosen to act, even if it meant being wrong. Her mind drifted back to moments in her past. Times when hesitation had cost her opportunities, or when silence had allowed problems to grow. This time, she refused to let fear or doubt paralyze her. She had decided, and she knew in her bones it was the right thing to do. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The girl fidgeted restlessly, her eyes darting at every sound. Margaret kept her arm wrapped protectively around her, whispering gentle reassurances. Inside, however, she was counting each second, praying that help would arrive before it was too late. The sound of sirens finally broke the silence. Distant at first, like a faint cry echoing through the neighborhood, but growing louder and closer. With every passing heartbeat, the girl sat up suddenly, her eyes wide, hope flickering in them for the first time since she had arrived. They're coming, Margaret whispered with relief. See? You weren't alone. Someone listened. Someone is here to help. The girl nodded, her small hand still gripping Margaret's tightly. In that moment, Margaret realized that her split-second decision wasn't just about dialing 3 numbers. It was about choosing to trust a child's whisper, about believing that even the smallest voices carried truths worth hearing. It was about courage, the courage to act when it mattered most. Even if the world around her seemed calm and ordinary, as the flashing lights turned into reality on her quiet street, Margaret felt a sense of quiet strength settle over her. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done her part. And sometimes, that was enough to change the ending of a story forever. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the narrow streets like a warning bell. Red and blue lights flickered against the houses, turning windows into blinking mirrors. Margaret tightened her arm around the little girl, who pressed herself closer as though the flashing lights might swallow her. For the first time since she had arrived, however, there was something new in the girl's eyes, not just fear, but hope. The police car rolled to a stop near Margaret's porch. 2 officers stepped out quickly, their movements sharp and purposeful. The taller one adjusted his radio on his shoulder, while the other scanned the street with narrowed eyes, already alert to the possibility of danger. Margaret stood slowly, her knees stiff, but her voice steady. She raised her hand and waved them over. The girl's grip on her sleeve tightened. "Don't let them leave," she whispered urgently. "Please tell them what I said." Margaret bent down, meeting her frightened gaze. "I'll tell them everything, I promise." The officers approached, their expressions serious but calm. "Ma'am, did you place the call?" the taller one asked. "Yes," Margaret replied firmly, though her voice carried the tremor of both fear and determination. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "This child came running to me. She says she saw a man hurting a woman nearby. She was terrified. I believed her, and I think you should too." The officers knelt down slightly, meeting the girl at her level. One of them softened his voice. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what you saw?" The little girl hesitated, glancing up at Margaret as if seeking permission. Margaret gave her a small nod of encouragement. With a shaky breath, the girl whispered. A man grabbed her. She tried to scream, but he covered her mouth. He was pulling her inside the house at the end of the street. She pointed with a trembling finger toward a house with dark curtains drawn across the windows. Both officers exchanged a quick, sharp glance, one that spoke volumes without words. They didn't doubt her. They didn't dismiss her. They understood. The urgency immediately. "All right," the taller officer said gently, standing back up. He spoke into his radio, calling for backup in a tone that carried no hesitation. Possible domestic situation, woman in danger. Requesting immediate support. Margaret exhaled slowly, realizing how close she had come to doubting the whisper herself. But now, with trained officers responding so quickly, her choice felt more important than ever. If she hadn't made that call, if she had ignored the girl's desperate plea, help might never have come. As the officers prepared to approach the house, the shorter one turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, please keep the child inside with you. Lock the door and stay put until we come back. We don't know what we're walking into." Margaret nodded firmly. She led the girl inside her small home, locking the door behind them. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish, but tonight it felt more like a safe haven than just a room. She guided the girl to the couch, offering her a warm blanket. The child clutched it tightly, but her eyes never left. The window where the police lights painted the world in red and blue. From the safety of the room, Margaret could hear the muffled sound of officers calling out commands. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the authority in their voices, the urgency in their steps. Then there was silence, an awful silence that stretched on too long, heavy, and suffocating. Margaret held the girl close, both of them waiting for something, anything, to break it. Then, suddenly, a cry pierced the air. It wasn't the cry of a child or a casual shout. It was the desperate cry of a woman, raw and full of pain. The girl on the couch jerked upright, her eyes wide. "That's her." She whispered frantically. Margaret's chest tightened. But she pulled the girl into her arms, whispering reassurance, even as her own heart raced. "It's all right. They've found her. The officers are there. She's not alone anymore." Minutes later, the sound of scuffling reached their ears, heavy boots, muffled shouts, the thud of something knocking against a wall. Then came the words that Margaret had been praying for. "She's safe. We've got her." The girl broke into tears again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. She buried her face in Margaret's shoulder, sobbing with the release of all the tension she had carried. Margaret held her tightly, whispering, "See, darling. Your voice mattered. Your courage saved her." Not long after, one of the officers returned to the porch, his expression softer. Now, Margaret stepped outside carefully, the girl still holding her hand. The officer gave them both a nod of respect. "You did the right thing calling us. The woman was in real danger. If we had gotten there any later..." He shook his head, leaving the rest unsaid. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes shining with both sorrow and pride. She looked down at the girl beside her, who stood a little taller now, as though the weight of being unheard had finally lifted. That call Margaret almost second-guessed had changed everything. It had turned a frightened whisper into a lifeline. It had saved someone who might not have survived another hour. And it had proven that even the quietest voices can carry enough power to alter the course of a life. Margaret knew night would not end without memories of fear. But she also knew the story would always carry a lesson when faced with a choice. When the world hands you a whisper heavy with truth, one decision, just one, can be the difference between silence and salvation. Asterisk, the flashing lights painted the street in waves of red and blue, bouncing off windows and casting eerie shadows across the quiet neighborhood. More police cars arrived, followed by an ambulance whose siren faded into a steady hum as it pulled up. The once peaceful street, where moments ago only the sound of birds could be heard, now throbbed with urgency. Neighbors began peeking out from behind curtains, some stepping onto their porches, whispering questions they were too afraid to ask out loud. Inside Margaret's small living room, the little girl pressed her face against the window, her wide eyes reflecting the lights outside. She had stopped crying, but her hands were still trembling as she clutched the edge of the curtain. Margaret stood close behind her, gently resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Are they helping her?" The girl whispered, her voice so soft it barely carried beyond the glass. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her tone gentle but firm. "The officers are trained for this." She isn't alone anymore. Asterisk outside, two paramedics rushed past with a stretcher, their medical bags bouncing at their sides. Margaret caught a glimpse of them disappearing into the house the girl had pointed out earlier, the house with the dark curtains and silent windows that had hidden so much. For years, Margaret had passed that house without giving it a second thought. Tonight, it felt like the center of a storm. The silence broke suddenly with a sharp cry. This time, it was a woman's voice, raw and filled with desperation, but it wasn't the cry of someone being silenced. It was the cry of someone being freed. Margaret felt her chest tighten, and the girl spun around to look at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "They found her," the girl said, her voice quivering with relief. Moments later, the front door of the house burst open. Two officers emerged, their arms supporting a woman who looked pale and shaken. Her clothes disheveled, her hair tangled as though she had struggled hard. Behind them, another officer restrained a man, his hands cuffed tightly. Behind his back, his face was twisted with anger, but his voice was drowned out by the firm commands of the police. The little girl gasped. "That's him. That's the man I saw." Her small body tensed, but Margaret quickly knelt down beside her, holding her close. "You're safe now, darling. He can't hurt you. Look, he's in handcuffs. He won't be able to hurt anyone." "Anymore," Margaret whispered, her words steady even though her own heart was pounding. The paramedics guided the rescued woman toward the waiting ambulance. Her steps were unsteady, her face streaked with tears, but she was alive. Margaret could see the relief flooding her expression even from a distance. It was the face of someone who had been pulled back from the edge, saved just in time. The little girl pressed her forehead against Margaret's shoulder, and for the first time since she had run onto the porch, she let out a deep, shaky sigh, not from fear, but from release. Margaret wrapped her arms around her, stroking her hair and whispering, "You did this. You saved her. If you hadn't spoken up, she might not have made it." The girl looked up at her with tearful eyes. "But I was so scared." Margaret smiled gently, her wrinkles deepening with warmth. "Courage doesn't mean you weren't scared. Courage means you were scared, but you still spoke up. That makes you braver than most people." Outside, neighbors began gathering closer, murmuring among themselves as officers moved the man into a police car. Some people looked shocked, others ashamed that they hadn't noticed what was happening so close to their homes. A few caught sight of Margaret and the little girl at the window, and whispers began to spread how the child had sounded the alarm, how the elderly woman had listened. The ambulance doors closed with a soft thud, and the vehicle's engine rumbled to life. Its siren did not wail this time. Instead, the flashing lights spoke silently of urgency as it pulled away. Carrying the rescued woman to safety, Margaret and the little girl watched until it disappeared at the end of the street. Only then did Margaret step back, guiding the child toward the couch once more. "It's over now," she said softly. "She's safe, and you're safe." The girl's small hand gripped hers tightly. "If I hadn't run to you, what would have happened?" Margaret didn't want to think about that answer. She knew the truth was dark, that silence might have allowed the danger to continue, maybe even claim a life. But instead of frightening the child with what-ifs, she smiled gently and said, "You came to me, and that's what matters. You were." Her voice when she couldn't cry out loud enough. Never forget that. Outside, the police cars began to disperse, their lights dimming as orders slowly returned to the neighborhood. But the street no longer felt the same. To Margaret, and certainly to the little girl, it would always be the place where fear turned into bravery, where whispers turned into rescue, and where help finally arrived. Margaret sank into her armchair, the weight of the night pressing down on her weary shoulders. The girl nestled beside her, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but shining faintly with pride. The chaos outside had passed, but inside, a quiet bond had formed, a bond between a frightened child who refused to stay silent and an elderly woman who chose to listen. And as the night grew darker, Margaret understood one thing with crystal clarity. Sometimes the arrival of help isn't just about the flashing lights and uniforms. Sometimes help begins the very moment someone decides to believe. The neighborhood, once wrapped in silence, now buzzed with whispers and murmurs. Porch lights flicked on one by one, and people stood in clusters on their lawns, pointing toward the house where the police had just intervened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged guilty glances, realizing they had gone about their evening routines while a tragedy nearly unfolded just steps away. Inside Margaret's living room, the little girl sat curled in the corner of the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. She looked smaller than ever, but there was something different in her expression now. The raw fear that had twisted her features before was beginning to soften into something else, relief, perhaps, or the first glimmer of pride. A gentle knock came at the door. Margaret rose carefully, her bones aching from the tension of the night, and opened it to find one of the officers standing there. His cap was tucked under his arm, and the red and blue lights still flickered across his uniform. His expression, though serious, carried a warmth that hadn't been there earlier. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "may we come in for a moment?" Margaret nodded and stepped aside. The officer entered, followed by another who carried a notepad. They both removed their caps as a gesture of courtesy, their eyes immediately falling on the little girl. She looked up nervously, clutching the blanket tighter. But Margaret gave her a reassuring nod. The taller officer crouched down, so he was eye level with her. His voice softened, gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, I want you to know something very important. The woman you saw is safe because of you. You did the right thing. You were brave enough to speak when others might have stayed quiet." The girl's eyes welled with tears again, but this time they weren't the tears of fear. They were tears of release, of being understood. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I was so scared. I thought nobody would believe me." The officer shook his head firmly. "But someone did believe you. And because of that, we were able to help. May not realize it yet, but tonight, you saved a life." Margaret's throat tightened as she watched the exchange. She placed a supportive hand on the girl's shoulder. "See, darling, I told you your voice mattered. Look at what you've done." The second officer scribbled notes, documenting every detail, but even he paused to glance at the child with respect in his eyes. It wasn't every day that such courage came from someone so small. When the officers finished their questions, the taller one stood and looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, I want to thank you too. Not everyone would have acted so quickly, especially when the story came from a frightened child. Your decision made all the difference." Margaret's cheeks flushed faintly. She wasn't one for praise. But she understood the weight of his words. "I only did what anyone should do," she replied softly. "She came to me because she trusted me. I couldn't let her down." The officers gave a final nod of gratitude before stepping back outside. The door closed, but the weight of their acknowledgement lingered in the air. Margaret turned to see the girl, watching her intently. Her small face glowing with something new, something brighter than fear. "Did I really help her?" the girl asked quietly. Margaret knelt down beside her, taking both of her hands into her own wrinkled ones. "Yes, my dear. You were the reason help came. You were frightened, but you didn't keep silent. That takes more courage than most adults could ever show." The girl blinked, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. It was fragile, almost shy, but it was the first real smile Margaret had seen on her face since the ordeal began. Later, that night, as the neighborhood slowly returned to calm, word began to spread. Some neighbors knocked on Margaret's door, offering warm words and asking about the child. Whispers of admiration floated through the community about the girl who had run for help, about the elderly woman who had chosen to listen. For once, the gossip wasn't about who planted the best roses or whose fence needed fixing. It was about courage, about compassion, about how even the smallest voice could change the course of an entire night. Margaret sat with the girl long after the police left, the blankets still wrapped around her shoulders. They shared quiet moments together, Margaret humming softly, the child resting her head against the old woman's arm. In the silence, there was no fear now, only comfort. The night had begun with a terrified child running alone down a darkened street, but it was ending with that same child recognized, respected, and, most importantly, believed. Her whisper had become a force that saved someone else's life, and in doing so, it had transformed her own. Margaret knew that years from now, when the girl was older, she would look back on this night, not just as the night she was frightened, but as the night she discovered her own bravery, and perhaps she would carry that lesson with her forever. For now, though, was enough that the girl could finally close her eyes and rest safe in the knowledge that her courage had been seen, heard, and honored. Asterisk. The street eventually fell quiet again. The flashing lights faded into the distance, and the echoes of hurried footsteps disappeared with them. One by one, neighbors closed their doors, returning to their homes with heavy thoughts and hushed conversations. But inside Margaret's house, the air still carried the weight of what had happened. The little girl sat nestled against Margaret's side. Her small fingers tangled in the old woman's cardigan as though afraid to let go. She was exhausted, her eyes heavy, but she refused to sleep. Every time her eyelids fluttered shut, they flew open again, as if she feared the danger might return the moment she drifted away. Margaret stroked her hair gently, humming the same soft tune she used to hum for her grandchildren. The girls, breathing slowed, her body finally beginning to relax in the safety of the warm living room. For the first time that night, Margaret allowed herself to exhale deeply. The worst was over, and yet she knew this night would not easily fade into memory. She thought about the whisper, the fragile, trembling words that had carried so much weight. A whisper that could have been dismissed, brushed aside as the wild imagination of a frightened child. But instead, it had been heard, it had been believed. And because of that, lives had been changed. Margaret glanced down at the girl, who was now dozing lightly against her. She realized something profound. The child hadn't just saved the woman who was in danger. She had also given the entire neighborhood a lesson they would never forget. A lesson about courage, about compassion, and about the importance of listening, especially when the voice speaking is small. Hours later, when the girl was finally asleep, Margaret sat alone in her armchair, staring out the window at the quiet street. The house where the attack had taken place looked ordinary again, but Margaret knew better. She wondered how many times people had walked past that home, never realizing what was happening behind closed doors. It was a chilling thought that suffering could hide in plain sight, unnoticed until someone chose to see. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. People who had kept their distance the night before now came forward, some with apologies, others with admiration. They spoke about the bravery of the child, about Margaret's quick decision, about how easily the story could have ended differently. One neighbor, a woman named Clara, shook her head with tears in her eyes. "I was sitting in my kitchen the whole time," she confessed. "I didn't hear anything, or maybe I didn't want to hear. But that little girl, she didn't turn away. She saw and she spoke up. I'll never forget that." The story spread quickly, carried from porch to porch, then beyond the neighborhood itself. By evening, local news had caught wind of it. They reported how a frightened child and an elderly woman had together stopped a tragedy. The words heroic and brave were used, but Margaret knew the truth was simpler. It wasn't about grand heroism. It was about listening, about trusting, about choosing to act when hesitation could have been easier. For the little girl, the recognition mattered less than the feeling of safety she now carried. She had been terrified, but in the moment when it mattered most, she had run toward help instead of hiding. And that act would become a part of her forever, a reminder that even small voices can create big changes. Margaret, too, carried her own lesson. She realized that growing older didn't mean her role in the world was finished. That night had proven that sometimes being present, being willing to listen, was enough to alter the course of events. She had thought her days of making a difference were behind her, but the little girl's trust had reminded her that anyone at any age can become the turning point in someone else's story, as days turned into weeks. The memory of that night lingered in the community. Parents reminded their children never to stay silent if they saw something wrong. Neighbors became more attentive, more willing to check on one another. The story became a quiet warning etched into the fabric of their lives. Danger can hide in plain sight, but so can the opportunity to save someone. For Margaret and the little girl, their bond deepened. They shared afternoons on the porch, sipping tea or playing simple games. Sometimes the girl would glance down the street, her face thoughtful. "Do you think she's okay now?" "The woman we saved?" she asked once. Margaret smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "I believe she's stronger now because she knows she wasn't forgotten. She knows someone cared enough to speak up for her. And that can make all the difference." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with quiet pride. For the first time, she seemed to fully understand the power of her own actions. And so, the lasting lesson of that night was not just about fear or danger, was about courage found in unexpected places, about the strength of compassion, and about the importance of listening to the quietest voices. It was a reminder that whispers can save lives.